Hello again and welcome to part 2 of our portrait drawing adventure. I'm Asia, I'm a part-time artist who works mainly with color pencils. If you've been following along, I hope you're excited to jump into the next phase. If you're just joining now, no worries. If you want, you can always check out part 1, link in the description below. In part 1, we focus on laying the groundwork for the portrait and drawing face features. But now we're moving forward with the another fun part, refining the skin tones and adding depth to your drawing. Today we'll be working on adding layers to the skin and creating texture to bring our portrait to life. Let's dive in and get started. When it comes to the skin in portraits, one of the most important things to remember is that patience is key. Creating realistic skin tones requires time and multiple layers. If you've already laid down your first few layers, you're on the right track. Now it's all about building up the layers gradually to get that rich, natural look. In part 1, we added some basic sketching with light pencil marks and made sure to outline the areas where the light hits and where the shadows fall. At this point, you can also see that I used a white pencil to mark the main highlights. This was done to help guide me later on and to create a sense of vibrancy. By highlighting certain areas like the cheekbones, the nose, I set up a good foundation for where the light will be more intense. These highlights will help the portrait pop and add that dynamic contrast between light and shadow. Now let's look at the first layers of skin that I'm adding. This part is about simplifying things a bit, keeping it light and subtle. Remember that less is more at this stage. I'm applying the first layers of color with very soft, light strokes. These layers will be light enough so that you can still see the sketch and the structure beneath them. You want to pay attention to the values. This is how dark or light different parts of the skin are. To really focus on this, I suggest squinting your eyes. When you squint, it helps reduce the details so you can focus more on the big picture, the light and dark areas of the face. Try to see if there are places where the light is the most intense, like the top of the nose or the cheekbones. On the other hand, the areas of the face where shadows fall are the spots you want to gradually darken with more pigment. Once you've established your light and dark areas, open your eyes and take in the colors of the skin. The skin isn't just one tone. You'll notice subtle variations in color, and this is where you can start to have fun. For this portrait, I've planned a palette mainly consisting of warm browns, which are perfect for the autumn mood I wanted to evoke. I've chosen a rich, earthy palette because it reminds me of those warm autumn tones, golden browns, soft reds and hints of yellows. As we go, you'll start noticing that we're not just adding color for the sake of color. We are building depth and dimension with each layer. It's important to remember that realism comes from layers. One layer alone won't give you that lifelike depth you're looking for. I'm starting by adding light layers of color. Don't press too hard just yet. Let each layer settle in the paper. Light strokes help the pigment flow smoothly and evenly, without becoming too heavy or thick. I always start off gently, because I want to keep my options open. If you press too hard too early, it will be much harder to add layers later. You'll be left with a layer of waxy or saturated pigment that won't allow for the detail you need in the later stages. Only when I'm adding my final layers do I press more firmly with the pencils. When I do this, the pigment really sticks to the paper and I can start seeing the contrast more clearly. So if you're feeling like you're not seeing the effects immediately, don't worry. Just keep layering lightly for now, and in a few stages, you start to notice the contrast and depth forming. For best results, always make sure your pencils are sharp. It sounds simple, but sharp pencils really help with precision and fine details. A sharp tip will allow the pigment to settle into the fine texture of the paper more easily, and it will give you control over the smoothness of your layers. When the pencil is sharp, it's easier to get those fine lines and smooth shading. Now let's talk about adding unconventional colors into the skin tones. I know it might sound strange, but using blues, greens, oranges, yellows and purples in the skin is a great way to give your portrait that natural look. Skin isn't one color, and there are many subtle color shifts that occur, depending on the lighting and the structure of the face. For example, in places where shadows fall, I'll use greens or cool reds. These cooler tones create the illusion of depth and help make the face look more three-dimensional. It's important not to overdo it. Just use these colors in the shadowed areas to create dimension. For areas where the skin is thinner, like under the eyes or in the inner corners of the eyes, blues and purples are great choices. These cooler colors mimic the thinner, more delicate skin, and they really help emphasize the depth in these areas. I also use blue when drawing the sclera, the white of the eye, because the sclera isn't actually perfectly white. It has subtle hints of blue and grey, especially in the shadowed areas. Don't forget about yellow. Yellow is great for adding life and warmth to the skin, especially in areas where the light is brightest, like the tops of the cheeks, the forehead and the nose. It can help bring your portrait to life and give it that healthy, glowing skin look. Light red can also be used to add a flush to the cheeks. This adds warmth and life to the portrait, making it feel more dynamic. It's very important to balance these colors carefully. As you layer in blues, greens and reds, you want to step back and look at the overall effect. Experiment with these colors, but keep it in check. Remember, we're creating realistic skin tones, not Shrek skin tones. If you apply too much of one color, you could end up with something that looks unnatural. But if used subtly, these colors will add realism, depth and vibrancy to your portrait. For beginners, don't be afraid to experiment. You might make mistakes, and that's perfectly fine. Experimenting is the best way to learn. If you start to feel more comfortable using these colors, and eventually you develop a sense of balance. You'll learn where to apply more pigment, where to leave it softer, and how to control the intensity of each tone. In fact, I encourage you to play with these unconventional colors. Try using some blue under the eyes or green along the sides of the nose and see how it affects the portrait. Just make sure to take a step back often to check out the overall result. I want to take a moment to talk about some essential techniques for refining the skin tone and creating depth. At this stage, we've laid out the basic structure of the portrait, and now it's time to focus on adding those final touches to make the skin look more lifelike. Let's start by talking about shadows. When you're working on the shadows of the skin, it's crucial to avoid using black. Black can create a harsh, unnatural look that makes the skin seem flat and overworked. Instead, use a combination of brown tones or complementary colors that will bring out the richness in the shadows. For example, if your subject has orange undertones in the skin, using a little blue in the shadowed areas will create contrast without overpowering the natural warmth. If your subject has more red undertones, try using green. This contrast will deepen the shadows and add realism. For yellow undertones, a touch of purple can work wonders. These colors will blend more naturally into the skin and give the face a softer, more organic look. Think of these complementary tones as your secret to build depth without making your shadows too harsh. Another important thing to remember is how you layer your colors. Building up the skin tones and shadows gradually is key to achieving a realistic effect. Apply your colors gently, using soft layers so that the pigment sinks into the paper slowly. The key is to be patient. Layering will allow you to add depth over time, and it's much easier to add more layers than it is to take them away. One thing I always emphasize is to avoid pressing too hard in the early layers, as this can make it impossible to add further layers later on. You want to have the freedom to build depth and texture, and pressing too hard early on can hinder that. Now when you reach the final layers, this is when you really start to see everything come together. For these finishing touches, I recommend using softer pencils, like the Caran d'Ache Luminance range. These pencils blend beautifully and allow you to smooth out the transitions between different tones. The light skin tones and light browns or beiges from this range are fantastic for blending and softening areas like the cheeks, forehead and around the nose. I personally love using this to smooth out the texture of the skin and create those gentle, seamless transitions between light and shadow. Using pencils like this will give your portrait that beautiful, soft glow that makes the skin appear radiant and realistic. When it comes to the shadows, in this case you can refine those darker areas using brown and dark brown pencils. I usually turn to my Faber-Castell Polychromos for this step. These pencils provide a lot of pigment and are perfect for adding rich dark tones where the light doesn't reach. The darker areas of the face will give the portrait depth, and by layering these shades you can create a more realistic sense of form. One of the coolest things you can do is to add complementary colors into the shadows to really make them pop. For example, if the shadows are in a warm area of the face, adding a touch of green can make those areas feel more alive. In contrast, adding purple in places with yellow undertones can make the light areas feel even lighter, enhancing the warmth of the portrait without going overboard. These small touches can help create a more dynamic and natural look that isn't flat or monotone. Moving on to the areas of the face where the light hits, like the top of the cheekbones, the bridge of the nose, these areas need to be highlighted to make the face come alive. For these highlights, I use the Caran d'Ache Luminance pencils, particularly the light skin tones and soft, almost white pinks. These pencils give a nice soft glow, helping the skin look luminous and catching the light in just the right places. By applying these light shades to areas that naturally receive the most light, you'll create contrast with the darker shadows and give the portrait more dimension. Finally, when it comes to the strongest highlights, especially the brightest spots on the skin, I reach for a white pencil. I especially love the Caran d'Ache Luminance White or Derwent Drawing Chinese White. These white pencils are very soft, smooth and perfect for adding those final light touches that will give your portrait that glow and realism. A light application of white pencil in these areas will make the light truly pop and add that necessary contrast between the highlights and shadows. Now that we've wrapped up the stage of the skin details, you should start seeing your portrait coming to life with these delicate highlights and shadows. Remember that it takes patience to build the skin tone gradually, but the end result is always worth it when you can see the form and light come together naturally. In the next part, we're going to be focusing on something I absolutely love, the hair. This is where you'll be able to really start adding texture, volume, and I'll be sharing some fantastic tips to help you draw realistic flowing hair. We will talk about the best techniques for building layers in hair, adding highlights and creating the illusion of depth, all while keeping the overall look soft and natural. But before I end this part, I just want to remind you that if you're enjoying these tips, you can check out my YouTube channel or Patreon page. There will be plenty more portrait tips coming your way, so stick around for part 3, where we will work on the hair and add those final touches that will make this portrait truly shine. I'm so excited to continue this journey with you, and I hope you're feeling inspired to keep going. See you in the next one, thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!